The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete steps of Building 47 at Fort Morrison Military Base. Sarah Chen adjusted her laptop bag on her shoulder as she climbed the stairs to the communications center. As a civilian contractor specializing in encrypted satellite systems, she had been working on the base for 6 months. But something felt different today. The usual friendly nods from passing soldiers seemed absent, replaced by cold stares and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked by. Sarah had discovered something 3 days ago that kept her awake at night. While running routine diagnostics on the base's communication network, she stumbled upon encrypted files that shouldn't have existed. The data streams were routing through unauthorized channels, sending classified military intelligence to external servers. What made her blood run cold was the timestamp. These transmissions had been happening for months, right under everyone's nose. She had tried to report her findings through proper channels, but every attempt was met with bureaucratic delays and dismissive responses. Her supervisor, Colonel Harrison, had brushed off her concerns, claiming the files were part of a classified exercise she didn't have clearance to know about. But Sarah knew better. Her security clearance was high enough to access most operational data, and these files didn't match any authorized protocols. The weight of her discovery pressed down on her shoulders as she reached the top of the concrete steps. Behind her, she could hear footsteps. But when she turned around, the stairwell appeared empty. The echo of her own movement seemed to bounce off the walls in an unsettling way. She pushed through the heavy metal door into the building, unaware that 2 figures in military fatigues had been following her from the parking lot. Inside the communications center, Sarah settled at her workstation and powered up her computer. The familiar hum of servers and the soft clicking of keyboards from other technicians usually comforted her. But today, the atmosphere felt charged with tension. She noticed that several of her colleagues avoided making eye contact, and Dr. Martinez, who usually stopped by her desk every morning with coffee and updates about his weekend plans, was conspicuously absent. As she began her work, Sarah decided to make copies of the suspicious files onto a secure external drive. If something happened to her, at least there would be evidence of what she had found. The process was slow and nerve-wracking, as she had to be careful not to trigger any security alerts. Every few minutes, she glanced around the room to make sure no one was watching her unusual activity. Around noon, Sarah received an encrypted message on her personal phone from an unknown number. The text was brief but chilling. "Stop digging or face consequences. This is your only warning." Her hands trembled as she read the message again. Someone knew exactly what she was investigating, and they were close enough to her daily routine to send targeted threats. The afternoon dragged on with an oppressive sense of being watched. Sarah noticed that the same 2 soldiers seemed to appear wherever she went, in the cafeteria during lunch, near the bathroom when she took breaks, and outside the building when she stepped out for fresh air. They never approached her directly, but their presence was unmistakable and intimidating. As evening approached, Sarah made the decision to leave the base early and contact a friend in military intelligence who might be able to help her navigate the situation safely. She packed her laptop and the external drive containing the copied files into her bag, planning to analyze everything more thoroughly from the safety of her apartment off base. The communications center was nearly empty as she prepared to leave. Most of the day shift had already gone home, and the skeleton crew for the evening shift was just arriving. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anxiety as she walked toward the exit. The sooner she got off the base, the safer she would feel. The corridor leading to the main exit was dimly lit, with several overhead fluorescent lights flickering intermittently. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as she made her way toward the stairwell. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of doors opening and closing. But when she looked back, the hallway appeared deserted. As Sarah pushed open the door to the stairwell, she was startled to find the 2 soldiers she had noticed throughout the day standing on the landing below. They looked up at her with expressions that were hard to read in the poor lighting. One of them, a tall man with sergeant stripes, spoke in a low voice that echoed in the concrete stairwell. "Miss Chen, we need to have a conversation with you about your recent activities on the base network." Sarah's heart began racing as she realized she was alone in the stairwell with these 2 men. The building was mostly empty, and the thick concrete walls would muffle any sounds from the outside. She clutched her laptop bag tighter and tried to keep her voice steady as she responded. I'm not sure what you're referring to. I've been doing routine maintenance on the communication systems, just like always. The second soldier, stockier with corporal stripes, stepped up one stair closer to her. We think you know exactly what we're talking about. You've been accessing files that don't concern you, and asking questions that could put a lot of people in danger. The implication in his words was clear, and Sarah felt trapped between the two men and the concrete walls of the stairwell. She tried to think of an escape route, but the only way out was down the stairs, directly past both soldiers. Her mind raced as she considered her options, none of which seemed particularly good. I was just doing my job, she said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. If there are files I shouldn't have accessed, then maybe someone should have told me about the restrictions beforehand. The sergeant shook his head slowly. This goes way beyond your job description, lady. You stumbled onto something that could compromise ongoing operations and put lives at risk. We're here to make sure you understand the seriousness of the situation. As the tension in the stairwell escalated, Sarah noticed that both soldiers had positioned themselves strategically to block her escape routes. The taller one controlled the path down the stairs, while the other had moved to cut off any retreat back through the door she had entered. The concrete walls seemed to close in around her as she realized how vulnerable her position had become. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We want you to forget what you think you saw, the corporal replied. Delete any copies you might have made, and never mention this to anyone. Consider it a matter of national security. Sarah knew that complying with their demands would mean abandoning any chance of exposing the security breach she had discovered. But refusing could put her in immediate physical danger. As she weighed her options, she noticed that the sergeant had moved one step closer, reducing the space between them even further. The fluorescent light above them flickered ominously, casting shifting shadows on the concrete walls. In that unstable lighting, Sarah saw something in the soldiers' expressions that made her blood run cold. These weren't just intimidation tactics, they were prepared to use force if necessary to silence her. In a moment of desperation, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She pretended to agree to their demands, while secretly planning to escape and expose everything she had learned. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she heard footsteps echoing from the floors above. Someone else was coming down the stairwell. The footsteps from above grew louder, and Sarah felt a flicker of hope that someone might witness whatever was about to happen in the stairwell. But her hope quickly turned to horror when she recognized the voice calling down from the upper landing. It was Colonel Harrison, her supervisor, the same man who had dismissed her concerns about the unauthorized data transmissions. Sergeant Blake, Corporal Morrison, is everything proceeding according to plan? Harrison's voice echoed down the concrete stairwell, with an authority that made Sarah's stomach drop. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her own supervisor was involved in whatever conspiracy she had uncovered. Yes, sir, Sergeant Blake responded, his voice taking on a more formal military tone. Miss Chen and I were just discussing the importance of operational security and the consequences of unauthorized access to classified information. As Colonel Harrison descended the stairs, Sarah could see his face in the flickering fluorescent light. The man she had worked with for 6 months, who had seemed professional and trustworthy, now wore an expression of cold calculation. Any remaining hope she had harbored about finding allies within the command structure evaporated completely. Miss Chen, Harrison said as he reached the landing where she stood trapped between the two soldiers. I'm disappointed that you chose to ignore my earlier warnings about pursuing matters beyond your clearance level. We tried to handle this quietly, but you forced our hand. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process the implications of what she was hearing. The unauthorized data transmissions she had discovered weren't the work of enemy infiltrators or rogue operators. They were part of an organized effort involving her own colleagues and supervisors. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than she had imagined. What exactly are you involved in? She asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice despite the fear coursing through her body. Those files I found, they're selling military intelligence to foreign contacts, aren't they? Harrison's expression hardened. You have no idea what you're talking about. Those operations are classified at levels far above your security clearance. What you interpret as unauthorized activity is actually part of a sanctioned program that you have no business questioning. But Sarah had spent enough time analyzing the data to know that Harrison was lying. The file structures, encryption patterns, and routing protocols all indicated clandestine activities that bypassed normal military oversight. She had seen enough legitimate classified operations to recognize the difference between authorized secrecy and criminal conspiracy. If these operations are legitimate, then why are you threatening me instead of simply showing me the proper authorization documentation? Sarah challenged, knowing that her words might provoke a violent response but feeling compelled to push for the truth. Corporal Morrison stepped closer, his hand moving toward something attached to his belt. Because some secrets are too important for civilian contractors to understand, even when they think they're smart enough to figure things out. The implied threat in his gesture was unmistakable, and Sarah realized that her situation had moved beyond intimidation into genuine physical danger. The 3 military personnel surrounding her in the isolated stairwell clearly had no intention of letting her leave with the knowledge she had gained. Harrison checked his watch and nodded to the 2 soldiers. We need to resolve this quickly. There are other personnel who will be coming through this area soon, and we can't afford to have witnesses to our conversation. Sarah's heart pounded as she understood the implication. They were planning to harm her before anyone else could intervene. She glanced around the stairwell, looking for any possible escape route or weapon she could use to defend herself. The concrete walls offered no hiding places, and the metal handrails were too securely attached to be useful as improvised weapons. You can't just make me disappear, she said, trying to buy time while her mind worked frantically to find a solution. People know where I am. My colleagues will ask questions if I don't show up tomorrow. Also, Sergeant Blake shook his head with what might have been genuine regret. Accidents happen all the time, especially around military installations. Steep stairwells can be particularly dangerous, especially when people are carrying heavy equipment and lose their footing. The casual way he described her potential death sent chills down Sarah's spine. These weren't impulsive criminals acting out of desperation. They were calculating professionals who had clearly planned for this contingency. The realization that her death would be staged as an accident meant that even if her body was found, there would be no investigation into the conspiracy she had uncovered. In a moment of clarity born from desperation, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of pleading for her life or trying to negotiate, she pulled out her phone and held it up so all 3 men could see the screen. Everything we've said in this stairwell has been recorded and automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server, she announced, hoping her bluff would sound convincing. If anything happens to me, that recording will be automatically sent to multiple contacts in military intelligence, the FBI, and several journalists. The 3 men exchanged glances, and Sarah could see uncertainty creeping into their expressions. Modern smartphones did have capabilities that could make her claim plausible, and the consequences of having their conversation exposed would be catastrophic for their operation. Harrison was the first to recover his composure. You're lying. If you had that kind of fail-safe system in place, you would have mentioned it earlier when we first approached you about dropping your investigation. Sarah forced herself to maintain eye contact with him despite her fear. I only activated the system when I realized how dangerous this situation had become. The recording started the moment you acknowledged that Sergeant Blake and Corporal Morrison were acting on your orders. Corporal Morrison looked nervously at his superior officers. Sir, if there's even a chance she's telling the truth, we need to consider the implications. A recording like that could bring down the entire operation and implicate dozens of personnel. But Sergeant Blake seemed skeptical. She's a civilian contractor, not a spy. I doubt she has access to the kind of sophisticated security systems she's describing. This is just a desperate attempt to save her own life. Quote, Harrison studied Sarah's face carefully, trying to determine whether her claim was real or an elaborate bluff. The stakes were too high for him to make the wrong decision. If she was telling the truth, harming her would guarantee their exposure and prosecution. But if she was lying, letting her go would mean accepting that their entire operation was compromised. Show us the recording system, Harrison demanded. If you can prove that you actually have this capability, Then we can discuss alternative arrangements." Sarah realized that her bluff had bought her some time, but she was still trapped in the stairwell with 3 people who wanted her dead. Even if she could convince them that harming her would expose their operation, they might decide to take their chances and stage her accident anyway. The tension in the stairwell was broken by the sound of footsteps echoing from several floors above. Someone else was entering the stairwell, and their rapid pace suggested urgency. Harrison motioned for silence as they all listened to determine who was approaching and how much time they had before being discovered. The footsteps were accompanied by radio chatter that grew louder as the person descended the stairs. Sarah caught fragments of military communication protocols that suggested the newcomer was responding to some kind of emergency or urgent situation. Hope flickered in her chest as she realized that whatever was happening might provide the distraction she needed to escape. "Base security to all stations." A voice crackled through a radio from somewhere above them. "We have reports of unauthorized personnel in Building 47. All non-essential personnel should evacuate immediately while we conduct a security sweep." The 3 conspirators looked at each other with growing alarm. If base security was conducting a sweep of the building, they would have to account for their presence in the stairwell and explain why they were detaining a civilian contractor. The investigation Sarah had stumbled upon was apparently not the only security concern affecting the base that evening. Harrison made a quick decision. "We'll have to continue this conversation later. Right now, we need to respond to the security alert and make sure our own activities don't draw unwanted attention." But as they prepared to separate and leave the stairwell, Sarah realized that this might be her only chance to escape their control. Once they left the building and regrouped, they would likely make sure she never had another opportunity to expose their conspiracy. The approaching security personnel represented her best chance for survival and justice. In a split-second decision that would determine the rest of her life, Sarah took a deep breath and made her choice. Sarah opened her mouth and screamed at the top of her lungs, "Help! Someone help me!" The sound echoed through the concrete stairwell like a gunshot, reverberating off the walls and carrying up to the security personnel who were making their way down from the upper floors. The reaction from Harrison and his 2 subordinates was immediate and violent. Sergeant Blake lunged towards Sarah, his hand reaching out to cover her mouth and silence her cries for help. In the struggle, Sarah lost her footing on the concrete steps, and Blake's forward momentum sent both of them tumbling toward the metal handrail. The next few seconds unfolded in a nightmarish blur of pain and chaos. Sarah felt herself falling backward down the stairs, her laptop bag flying from her shoulder as she tried desperately to grab onto something to stop her descent. The concrete steps struck her back, shoulders, and head in rapid succession as she rolled and bounced down nearly a full flight of stairs before coming to rest on the lower landing. Blood streamed from a gash on her forehead, and her left arm was bent at an unnatural angle that suggested a serious fracture. The laptop bag had burst open during the fall, scattering her personal belongings and the external drive containing the copied intelligence files across the stairwell. Through her dazed and painful haze, Sarah could see Corporal Morrison scrambling to collect the scattered items before the security personnel arrived. The sound of her fall and continued screaming had attracted immediate attention from the approaching security team. Heavy boots thundered down the stairwell as multiple personnel rushed toward the scene of the disturbance. Sarah tried to focus her vision and call out again, but the impact to her head had left her disoriented and struggling to form coherent words. What happened here? The voice belonged to Captain Rodriguez from base security, a man Sarah recognized from the cafeteria but had never spoken with directly. He was accompanied by 2 military police officers who immediately began securing the scene and checking on Sarah's condition. Harrison had quickly adopted an expression of concern and confusion as he knelt beside Sarah's injured form. "There was some kind of accident," he said, his voice carrying just the right mixture of shock and worry. "Miss Chen appeared to lose her footing at the top of the stairs and fell. We were trying to help her when you arrived, but Sarah wasn't going to let Harrison control the narrative. Despite the pain shooting through her head and the metallic taste of blood in her mouth, she forced herself to speak clearly enough for the security personnel to understand her words. They pushed me," she gasped, pointing a shaking finger toward Harrison and his 2 accomplices. "They were threatening me about the files I found, the intelligence being sold to foreign contacts." Captain Rodriguez exchanged a meaningful glance with his fellow officers. What Sarah didn't know was that her discovery of the unauthorized data transmissions wasn't the first indication that something was wrong at Fort Morrison. For the past week, military intelligence had been investigating reports of classified information appearing on foreign intelligence networks, information that could only have come from someone with high-level access to base systems. Sergeant Blake, Corporal Morrison, step away from the injured woman and place your hands where I can see them, Rodriguez ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Colonel Harrison, I need you to remain exactly where you are until we can sort out what happened here. The two subordinate soldiers looked to Harrison for guidance, but the colonel was clearly calculating his next move. The situation had spiraled far beyond what they had planned, and the presence of base security meant that their conspiracy was about to be exposed, regardless of what happened to Sarah. Captain, I think Miss Chen may have suffered a head injury in her fall, Harrison said, attempting to discredit her accusations. She's obviously confused and making wild allegations that don't make any sense. We should focus on getting her medical attention rather than entertaining paranoid fantasies. But Rodriguez wasn't buying the explanation. Years of military experience had taught him to recognize when something didn't add up, and the scene in the stairwell raised numerous red flags. Why were a colonel and two enlisted men having a private conversation with a civilian contractor in an isolated stairwell after normal business hours? And why did the contractor's injuries look more consistent with being pushed than with a simple accidental fall? Medical personnel are already on their way, Rodriguez replied. But until they arrive, and until we complete our investigation, everyone present will remain secured and separated for individual questioning. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching paramedics could be heard echoing through the building's corridors. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her despite the pain. She had survived the immediate threat, and now there were witnesses to what had happened. The conspiracy she had uncovered would finally be exposed. But Harrison wasn't finished trying to control the situation. Captain Rodriguez, I understand your need to follow protocol, but this is clearly just an unfortunate accident involving a contractor who has been under considerable stress lately. Miss Chen has been making increasingly erratic claims about imaginary security breaches, and I was actually in the process of recommending that her contract be terminated due to concerns about her mental stability. Sarah tried to protest Harrison's characterization, but the medical personnel had arrived and were focused on stabilizing her injuries and preparing her for transport to the base medical facility. One of the paramedics, a young woman with gentle hands, leaned close to Sarah's ear as she worked. Don't worry about talking right now, the paramedic whispered. Just focus on staying conscious and let us take care of the medical issues. The security people know how to handle the rest. As Sarah was being loaded onto a stretcher, she caught sight of Corporal Morrison attempting to slip something into his pocket. Something small and rectangular that looked suspiciously like the external drive containing the copied intelligence files. Despite her injuries, she managed to raise her uninjured arm and point in Morrison's direction. The drive, she called out weakly. He has the evidence. Captain Rodriguez immediately ordered Morrison to empty his pockets and submit to a search. The corporal's face went pale as he realized that his attempt to conceal the evidence had been observed and reported. When the external drive was recovered and examined, it would provide concrete proof of the unauthorized data transmissions that Sarah had discovered. Within minutes of Sarah being transported to the medical facility, the situation at Fort Morrison escalated far beyond a simple assault investigation. The external drive contained evidence of months of systematic intelligence theft, involving multiple personnel at various levels of the command structure. The scope of the conspiracy was so extensive that it posed a serious threat to national security. General Patricia Hawkins, the base commander, was awakened at her quarters and briefed on the developing situation. As the implications became clear, she made the unprecedented decision to implement a complete base lockdown. No personnel would be allowed to leave Fort Morrison until a thorough investigation could be completed and all conspirators identified. General Marcus Thompson from military intelligence arrived by helicopter within 2 hours, followed shortly by General David Chen, no relation to Sarah, from internal security. The presence of 3 general officers at what had initially appeared to be a simple assault case sent shockwaves through the base personnel. Everyone understood that something extraordinary was happening, even though the specific details were being kept classified. The lockdown announcement came over the base-wide communication system just before midnight. All personnel were ordered to remain in their current locations until further notice. No phone calls, emails, or other communications would be permitted except through official channels. Military police established checkpoints at every building, entrance and exit. Sarah, recovering in the base hospital under armed guard for her own protection, watched through her window as the entire installation transformed into a maximum security facility. The investigation that began with her discovery of unauthorized file transmissions had revealed a spy ring that had been operating undetected for over 2 years. Over the following days, as Sarah's physical injuries began to heal, the full scope of the conspiracy emerged. Harrison had been recruited by foreign intelligence services 3 years earlier and had systematically identified and compromised other personnel who had access to valuable information. The network included technicians, analysts, communication specialists, and even some officers in sensitive positions. The external drive that Sarah had created contained not only the evidence of unauthorized transmissions, but also breadcrumb trails that led investigators to discover sophisticated money laundering operations, encrypted communication networks, and carefully planned operational security measures that had kept the spy ring hidden for years. Sarah's courage in confronting the conspiracy, despite the obvious personal danger, had prevented the theft of critical military intelligence that could have compromised ongoing operations and endangered the lives of military personnel around the world. Her willingness to risk her safety to expose the truth had saved countless lives and protected national security interests. The 3 generals who locked down Fort Morrison during the investigation later commended Sarah for her integrity, professionalism, and bravery. The complete investigation took 6 weeks to complete and resulted in the arrest and prosecution of 17 military personnel and civilian contractors who had been involved in the spy ring at various levels. Colonel Harrison received a life sentence in military prison for treason and espionage. Sergeant Blake and Corporal Morrison were court-martialed and sentenced to 25 years each for their roles in the conspiracy and their assault on Sarah. The investigation also led to the discovery of similar operations at 2 other military installations, resulting in additional arrests and security improvements throughout the military intelligence community. Sarah Chen returned to her work as a civilian contractor, but now with enhanced security clearance and a special role in developing improved systems for detecting unauthorized data transmissions. Her experience in uncovering and surviving the spy ring had given her unique insights into the vulnerabilities that hostile intelligence services could exploit. The concrete steps where Sarah had been pushed became a reminder to everyone at Fort Morrison that the price of security is constant vigilance, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who wear friendly uniforms and carry trusted credentials. Her story became a case study in military intelligence training programs, teaching future generations of security personnel to trust their instincts and pursue the truth regardless of the personal cost. Years later, when asked about that terrifying night in the stairwell, Sarah would say that the most important lesson she learned was that doing the right thing often requires accepting significant personal risk. But she also learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act despite fear when lives and principles are at stake.